Welcome to Boiling Point, the podcast to motivate ever-evolving entrepreneurs and forward-thinking movement pioneers. Our hosts, filmmaker Greg Hemmings and executive coach Dave Vale, are turning up the heat in the world's business communities. Our interviews with entrepreneurs, thought leaders, and movement makers are raising the temperature of inspiration. Live from the hottest studio in this quadrant of the universe, here are Dave and Greg.
Welcome back to the Boiling Point. Dave, how are you doing today, man?
Doing great. I'm just noticing you have an amazing haircut.
Well, I feel clean cut for the first time since COVID started. So that's good. And it's funny because at the very beginning of March, like the first week of March, I was in Cuba with lots of salt hair, salt water in the hair. And I never had a chance to cut it or get that salt water out until 2 days ago, months later at the barber when we finally got COVID barbers open.
So you had to pay like triple the fee, just to work through. But you know what? It is nice being back in a chair, isn't it? Like I did the same thing. My story is my hair was getting pretty crazy. I may have shared this on a previous podcast. And Mary Ellen, I'm just a buzz cut kind of guy, as you can tell, as people would know if they look at a picture of me. And Mary Ellen had, she was buzzing, and it just didn't feel right. Like it felt like I was just like, "Are you pressing the thing?" And I realized like, okay, don't be a backseat driver here. And at the end she goes, "Hey, it looks really good." And I was like, "Oh, okay, cool." I looked in the mirror and I'll just say that my wife is an amazing teacher, mother, life partner. She shouldn't be a barber. It was horrible. I had like bald spots and then some hair over here. So I ended up doing it myself for the first time. And I thought, I could do this. But anyways, I went back to the barber. So, and we have a guest that's is joining us. And
who has not been to the barber yet?
He's got a great head of hair and I'm very jealous. And this is not a topic about hair. So we're going to have to find Greg's
why don't we get out of the weeds here?
Get
out of the weeds and get to the point and introduce our guest, because we could talk about the details of the haircuts forever, but really we got to get out of the weeds.
We got to get out of the weeds, yes. And and Vince, if you know Greg at all, he is the master of the segue. Vince Marsh, welcome to the Boiling Point.
Welcome, Vince.
Thank you. Great to be here.
We're happy to have you here. Vince and I have known each other for a number of years, and we always have great conversations, Vince. And I'm excited to have you on, meet Greg, and drill into a few topics. And we're going to start with your book. But before we get there and go there, maybe give our listeners a little bit of a background on who you are and what caused you to write a book in general. Like, I mean, what a accomplishment.
And also, please make the connection to where the getting out of the weeds was actually a good segue, because, until we understand that, it's just a bad segue.
Well, it's a great segue. Just having the book, the title of the book is Get Out of the Weeds. So it's a great segue just from that perspective. But I'll try to answer that in a minute, but I'll address what Dave asked me first. I've been working with senior teams for pretty much exclusively for about 15 years. And way back in the day, I was an architect for almost 15 years. Then I got my original degree was in psychology. So I always had a real interest in human beings and their psychology and leadership development. So kind of went back and really dove back into that. So for the last 15 years, I've been working with senior teams and senior leaders. And the whole idea of, I never thought I'd write a book at all, but I certainly never thought I'd write a book about on the concept of how leaders get out of the weeds, or how they make what I call strategic time. And it really was the idea of doing that was an outgrowth of the work with my clients. So many of my clients were in the weeds. And I heard that expression so many times as I was working with senior leaders, that I finally decided, someone should write a book about how senior leaders get out of the weeds. And so that was the impetus for that. So hopefully that also answers, Greg, your question about the segue.
It was a beautiful reconciliation of that. Thank you so much.
If I could add to Vince's bio, a friend and a colleague of Vince's, Mark Anthony Ashfield, a partner with Deloitte, a number of years ago said, "You got to meet Vince. You got to meet Vince Marsh." And he raved and continues to rave about some of the workshops you'd put on, and how you supported leadership development internally at Deloitte. I know you worked external with clients as well, but and he would tell me specific stories, Vince, of like an exercise he would take them through, and it, you know, knowing you have the psychology background, it makes a lot of sense, kind of given what he would share. But like for him, you know, I don't think I'm misquoting here, but like transformational stuff. So, you know, so I said, yeah, I got, you know, and then I got to know you a little bit. And like I said, I always enjoy the conversations. You know, as an executive coach, I work with a number of leaders. As a leader myself, I can appreciate it. What is so challenging in your mind about, you know, staying strategic, you know, and staying away from drilling down and getting very tactical? Like what is it that creates that challenge?
Yeah, it's a great question, because, you know, almost every executive that I speak with will recognize that they need to be more strategic. It's part of the job. I mean, when you look at the senior team, their primary role is to develop and implement strategy and oversee the implementation of good strategy, and that's it. That's pretty much where it ends and begins, and they know that. And most senior executives are very highly conscientious. They're smart. They mean well, and all of a sudden they realize that over the course of a year, or the course of, you know, even longer than that, we're just not spending enough time actually talking about strategy. I think some of the reasons why this has become a bigger issue is that the nature of disruption in most businesses has really forced leaders to change the way that they do strategy. So strategy traditionally was something we did once a year, or we were lucky, and maybe even less. And we developed a document, and that was sort of a guiding document. And with the level of disruption that most organizations are facing now, they just can't do that kind of thing once a year. They've really got to be thinking strategically pretty much all the time, or they got to spend some time thinking strategically on an ongoing basis. So I recommend at least once a quarter, the senior team is getting together and they're spending a half day to a full day, really drilling down into the strategy, making sure that it's still working, taking the feedback from operations and kind of running that through to say, look, you know, are we learning some things that tell us the strategy is not quite doing as well as it needs to? So I think the disruption in the environment has made this a much more important thing. But a couple of other things. I dedicate a whole chapter in the book to this very point: is why is it that we know we need to spend more time on strategy, but we don't? And I just list 12 or 13 factors in most businesses that just drive people into the weeds. You know, performance measurement is normally short-term focused. You know, it's much more important that you meet last month's numbers than think really clearly about what might be happening in a year or 2 years in the business. So, you know, that's just one thing. Another thing is, in every organization, the senior team members are really on two primary teams. Their first team, which is the senior team, and then they lead the second team, which is the team that they lead, the functional or departmental team that they lead in the organization. And so very often your second team is demanding your time. They don't want you working on those more strategic problems, because they need you working, you know, down in the business. So I could go on and on. There are actually a number of reasons why it's so difficult to make this time. And another reason why I thought it was important to write the book.
Yeah, I feel it's really interesting. Like this current disruption with COVID is only one disruption in the past number of years that has kind of supported what you're saying there. That I have never found a 1-year strategic plan beneficial, except for getting the year off on the right foot, like charged up. But change is so fast, and things like COVID, for example, or things like the digitization of media, and there's all these different things that can disrupt someone's business, and you have to think on your toes. Just as a quick aside, I found it really interesting since COVID, our strategic team, our leadership team, has been meeting every single day, every morning, which we never did before. And the neat thing about that is we are looking at day-to-day to week-to-week strategy right now, which is not something we ever did before, but I think we're becoming stronger for it. And we bring in that second tier team, you know, the implementers for the meeting as well. So we all know what's going on. So that waste of energy of, you know, everybody knows the strategists need to focus on strategy and the doers have to keep on. It's a simple thing to do, but none of us seem to have really done that before we were forced to, you know?
Well, one of the things about, this idea of strategy, and I know something else I think that is changing because of the nature of disruption is that, we've traditionally really thought about the senior team thinking about strategy, and then everybody else kind of implements. But really, strategy is about choices. And so what you're doing is you've got a purpose and a direction, and there's things you're trying to achieve in the business overall. And then you make a number of high-level choices that will take the business in a certain direction. And then what you rely on is all the people that work in the organization to be making daily choices, like in their work, that are aligned to those strategic choices that you've made as senior leaders. And of course, you're also trying to work with them to help them make sure that alignment is maintained. So I actually feel like one of the big issues with strategic time is that when leaders drop into the business, when they get into the weeds, they actually do things very often that prevent them from thinking strategically, but also prevent their people from being more strategic. They actually drive them deeper into the weeds themselves. And in the book, I've got a very simple model. I call it the death spiral. And it's how senior teams drop into the weeds, and then they drop everyone else in the organization down further into the weeds. And they get into this cycle where they just cannot escape that. And it has impacts on talent. It has impacts on strategy implementation. It has very wide-reaching impacts in the organization. So it's a really significant issue for sure.
You, I have a little bias around the answer to this question personally, but I'm wondering the value of having someone external come in and support a team like Greg's team, or any senior leadership team, or any team for that matter. There's pros and cons to that. I wonder if you could speak to that.
Well, so I'm a big believer that senior teams are different than other teams in an organization. I just think that the nature of the problems that they're trying to solve they're higher in volatility, unfamiliarity, complexity, and so on and so forth. So they're just more difficult problems, sometimes significantly more difficult. So senior teams should be focused on the really difficult problems, and so because those problems are so difficult, they need to learn how to solve those problems more effectively. And they're different than the other kinds of problems in the organization. So they need to build capability in order to do that. And so I'm a big believer that senior teams will benefit from someone that can help them if that person is familiar with how senior teams need to work, which is different than most teams. So I believe that if you can find a coach or an advisor who can come in and is used to helping the senior team elevate their level of problem, their ability to solve more difficult problems, their problem-solving capability, I think that's a really important thing to be doing. Otherwise, very often what you'll be doing is if you're working with a team and they're focused on lower level problems, you might get them working effectively together to solve those. But when they try to solve the more complex problems, that's when they start running into trouble. So I'm a big believer in coaching and advisory services to teams, Dave. But I do believe for the senior team, you need to have someone who knows how to help you elevate your problem-solving capability, and that's a key piece.
It's in, like, I just think it's and I'd be interested in your thoughts around the psychology around this, but this idea of helping a team or even an individual, let's just stick with the team for now, but like a complex problem. And it seems like most of us are really hardwired to get very tactical instead of stepping back and really trying to understand what is the real issue here and what are a bunch of options and what's the best option, for us to go down. I've experienced in myself wanting to just take action, right? There's something
Sure.
about, you know what I mean? It feels good, right? And okay, we're doing something, but to what end, right? And it's so helpful to have someone, to your point, Vince, that will hold you back.
Sure. And
help you, look at other options and help you address what is the real issue we're addressing here, and how do we measure this, and what is a good outcome here, and it just feels like, we're in a world that's just trying to propel itself and move forward and take action, that it makes it hard to think strategically.
You bet.
Yeah. Just what are your thoughts?
Well, I think Greg talked before about strategic planning. There's always been some issues with strategic planning and the way that it's kind of traditionally run, and the stats would bear that out. In organizations, you depend on the people that are in your organization to be able to implement the strategy. But some studies show that less than 3% of people in an organization actually understand what the organizational strategy is. So it's never been as effectively run as it could be, but it's even worse than when if you don't have really effective strategic planning processes in the organization. I think that's a real incentive or disincentive for senior people to think strategically. I mean, you can get around the water cooler, or you can be in a meeting and you're having a good conversation and you highlight a problem, but unless you've got a mechanism for taking that problem and putting that into some kind of process where it's going to be analyzed and it's going to be looked at, and we can have some dialogue around it, and we can actually come to some decisions about it, it's just water cooler talk. And so I think very often we don't get that more strategic thinking because our processes aren't working very well. The other couple of things that I think get in the way, and one is related to people and collectively, and one is related to individuals. The ability to think strategically varies from person to person. Some people are just cognitively more equipped to think strategically than other people, and so you'll often find that people who are maybe less cognitively inclined, and so have lower potential for thinking, on really high level strategic problems. They may not attack those problems. They kind of avoid them. They focus on problems they can take on. The issue there is that strategic thinking capability, that ability, that can be developed, but the only way it can be developed is through actual practice. You've got to be actually working on strategic problems, or you'll never get better at it. So for lots of individuals, I think what happens is they close their door, they start thinking about a strategic problem. They don't really know how to tackle it because they just haven't had the experience doing it. And so they stop, and then they never gain that experience. So, another reason I wrote the book was this. I want people to think strategically, not just to solve strategic problems, but to develop the ability to actually solve strategic problems well. So I think it gets back to, there's many factors that kind of get in the way from people being able to do this on a regular basis.
So it's very much when people say to me, "Oh, I'm not a creative person," when I always push back, I'm like, "You sure are. You just haven't exercised that yet." So it's almost like a muscle that needs to. Do you think you could learn that skill to be strategic on strategic thinking, even on the smallest of decisions? It doesn't even matter where you are in the organization, but can you become strategic?
Absolutely. I mean, when you think about it, so what is strategy? Strategy is looking at two or three things that we're not quite sure what the connections are. Maybe we haven't seen that stuff before. What are the interrelationships? What are the underlying dynamics? And we're trying to understand what those things, what might be going on. And the way that most people learn about those underlying dynamics and those relationships is they just have experience. So the first time they encounter it, they don't do very well. It goes badly. Next time they go, "Oh, wait a minute. Last time I saw this, these three things resulted in this." And so already they've become more strategic. They're able to now look at the problem and say, "Well, I think I'll attack it differently than I did last time." And I think that our capacity for doing that is pretty big. If we're actually tackling strategic problems, because they're very different than the tactical ones, and we've got to gain the experience.
And how much responsibility is it from, let's say, the top in a typically structured organization to empower that type of strategic thinking for everybody at all levels? Because what I'm thinking with my shortcomings over the years as a leader learning to be strategic is we could make an incredible quarterly or annual strategy, but not really share it with everybody and not really get ownership or buy-in from everybody. And what is that responsibility for upper management to really get everybody on board and on side and digging into it together?
It's huge. I think it's actually one of the biggest roles that they've got. So we talk about senior people needing to create shareholder value, stakeholder value, and they do that through developing and overseeing the implementation of good strategy. And so you've got the senior team, and then each of those individuals on the senior team has got somebody below them, a direct report, And in order for the senior team members to focus where they need to focus, they need to get those people below them elevated in their capability. And very often that means they've got to offload problems that are of lower difficulty to those folks. And if they haven't developed those people effectively, if they haven't ensured that those folks are learning how to think more strategically, then they can't offload those problems to them. And I will tell you, we're going to work with many senior teams and leaders, and the number one reason why they will tell me that they can't think strategically is because they do not have the strength in their direct reports to delegate as much as they'd like to. And so I don't believe that that's always the number one thing, but even if it is, whose responsibility is it to develop your direct reports and to ensure that you've got the right people in those roles as you move into the future? It's the senior team leader's responsibility. So they need to be developing that talent.
Interesting. And so sorry, Dave, I keep on cutting you off. I'm on a train here. But going back to the weeds, I can see with a small team, let's say your direct reports just are not there yet, skill-wise. I can see a senior leader jumping into those weeds for training or for executing those harder problems until that next level really gets it. And is that the trap? Is that where we can get stuck into those weeds, would you say, and stop focusing on strategy?
Absolutely. So I talked before about the death spiral. That's part of the death spiral. So you've got let's say the VPs. So how this normally cycles through organizations is that very often when an organization is beginning to struggle, and especially they're struggling with disruption and struggling strategically, very often it's often because the senior team's just not focused where it needs to focus. It's too tactically focused. And so the problems that the organization is encountering, they don't have enough time to respond to them. They're kind of coming at them too fast. And so so what happens typically is that they might make a change maybe with the CEO. So because of increased disruption, there's a lot more CEO turnover than there used to be. It's almost 15% a year now. So very often you'll bring in a new CEO. CEO will come in and they'll say, look, well, we need to kind of refocus. We need to elevate our focus. And then they look at the VPs, the senior team that's supposed to help them, and they go, gee, I'm not sure I've got the right people. And so I think I read a stat that within 2 years, on average, 70% of a senior team is changed out when a new CEO comes in, because the CEO is looking for VPs that can elevate in that level of capability. So let's say that they find them and they get them. So now the senior team is focused on the right levels of problem and difficulty. And now the problem is below that at the director level. So the VPs are looking, and now the gap between them is really large between them and their directors. So now they have a choice. To your point, Greg, they can drop down to actually work with those directors and then get sucked into the weeds, which is then going to pull the CEO down, or they can try to sort of maintain a balance between the big strategic problems they need to stay focused on and the development of those people that are below them. And it's very, very difficult to do. It's when I've seen VPs who are trying to make that happen, they're really working hard because they're really doing two jobs at once. They're still kind of in the weeds a bit, because they haven't got the talent. They're trying to build the talent, and they're also staying focused on those bigger problems. So it's very daunting for VPs to pull that off, but sometimes they do. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Here's something that just occurred to me, and I've seen and experienced to a degree. Is you talk about that director level, the competencies required to be successful, and then someone has an interest in moving into a VP position and an executive position. What you're rewarded for is working differently as you get elevated, and so I think at least I'd be curious your thoughts on this, Vince, but I seem to see people that. It's a real struggle because, hey, this is what I was really good at and I have to give this up. Right. And I'm supposed to be operating at some level. And so it feels kind of nice. And especially when you talk about disruption, when things are hard, it's normal, I believe, for humans to gravitate towards what feels good. Right. Like what they've been rewarded for in the past. And often what needs to be done, to your point, is it requires a different executive level thinking, which is a completely different set of competencies required and skills to perform at that level. And there's that pull, right?
Absolutely. Dave, you're a coach as well, and you've probably experienced this. Where you'll ask a CEO or a VP, and you're coaching a VP, and you talk to the CEO, and you'll say to them, what do you think this VP needs to focus on? And they'll say, well, I always find that it's always the same version of the same thing, and that is they need to learn how to solve the problems that I'm dealing with. Like they need to elevate their ability to solve. Otherwise, I'm looking for a successor at some point, and I need someone who can show to me that they can start to solve these problems. So one of the things that I write about in the book, and I actually have a blog that I send out my blog every week, and I've just wrote a blog which will be coming out in a couple of weeks, and I called the blog entitled this "Always Have at least one strategic project," and so what I recommend to any VP or any director is that very often, because you're being pushed into the weeds, you might not be getting a lot of opportunity to build your strategic thinking capability, and that's going to hurt you in the long run. So always try to have at least one strategic initiative that you're working on. And so what I talk about in the blog is how leaders can make sure that happens. But one way that, say, if you're a director in an organization, how you can make it happen is it's a really simple sort of 4 or 5 step process. And step number 1, just pause, look around you at the clients that you're currently serving, and start to think about what kind of change could I make, a more strategic change that I could make that could make things better for these clients. So just think about that. And after you've thought about it, and you've got a couple of ideas, you take those ideas and you go talk to the clients and ask them what they think, and they're going to give you some ideas. So you take all that and you go to your boss and you say, look, I've been talking to my clients, and these are some of the higher level things we could do to really make our service better to them. What do you think? And most bosses are going to say to you, I think that's really cool. And so you just say, look, well, if I were to take one of these and do something about it, which one of these would you like me to work on? So the boss says, well, that one. So you say, okay, great. Well, if I'm going to work on that, if I put a plan together with a timeline, and if there's some resources I need, would you resource it? And would you hold me accountable for it? Would you kind of keep an eye on it? And so I could report to you about it. And I think 99% of bosses are going to say yes. And so now all of a sudden, pardon?
How could you say no presented that way?
Yeah. So thanks, Greg. So now you've got a strategic initiative that your boss is concerned with, that your clients want to see something happen, and you've got the ability now to actually shift some things, and it's going to force you to now start thinking more strategically and acting that way. And so I'm a big believer that everybody should have, certainly once you get to a more senior level in the organization, everyone should be working on something that's more strategic than their day job. At least one project all the time.
Awesome. Well, that's really good advice, because I was actually curious about that. And, because if someone's listening and they're saying, geez, I want to develop that, how do I do it? Well, you've just given a really good example. As we're wrapping up, I think there's a couple things, Greg, you'd really appreciate Vince's, he sends them every Monday. It's called the Monday Morning Reminder to Be Pioneer. And what you'll like about it as a creative person is not only Vince's writing, but it's his artwork as well.
Okay, so how do I find that? And our listeners, I'm going to look it up right now.
Well, my website is called seniorteamadvisory.com. And if you go there, you'll see the blogs that I've recently written. There's an archive. I've written about 125, 130 blogs, all on the subject of senior teams. And there's a spot there that you can subscribe.
Awesome. Thank you.
Like there's an old one I'm just looking at right now. It's entitled "Scared to Hire the Best?" And Vince he's got this picture of these 2 feet with shoes and the laces tied together, right? Anyways, it's really kind of a creative way of doing it. So there's your creative outlet. You're certainly creative, Vince.
Thank you.
How do and as we so people can find through the URL you just gave information. Can they get the book there as well?
Yes. Yep. They can order the book right from the website. It's now available.
Is there any advice you give to people about writing a book, having done it now?
That's good.
That's a great question. I would highly recommend that people talk to people who've written a book. That's number one.
Good idea.
And then I got some advice to actually hire someone it's self-published. So I talked to, and most books now are self-published. So I talked to someone who guided me through that process. So I'd recommend that. For your first book, for sure, those are two steps that I would take. And then once you've taken those two steps, you should be fine. Final thing I'd say about writing a book is most people think that it's the writing the book that is the tough part. I found that actually interesting, and I actually wrote it. So what I've done I've taken the advice that is in the book, and I create 2 hours a day of strategic time for myself. Now, I don't always maintain it. Hard to maintain that, but I think I do a really good job of 80% of the time. The first 2 hours every morning I spent on something strategic. So even though I had all my client work, because I was able to create that 2 hours, I was able to write the book in about 3 months. So 60,000 word book in about 3 months, 2 hours per day is doable. And then you think it's done, and you turn it over, but that's just that things are just getting started at that point. So the final thing I'd say about writing a book is just have patience. It's really worth it in the end, but it's for first time through, it can be a daunting process, but a lot of fun. I'd highly recommend it.
That's awesome, Vince.
I love that discipline around 2 hours a day.
Totally.
Strategic time. That is awesome.
Thank you.
So Greg, that's a good challenge for us. Eh?
Okay. What comes first, the 2 hours of strategy or actually getting out and doing exercise, which I have not done yet? We'll figure it out.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, there's an anecdote in the book. I was talking to someone on the West Coast. We had a meeting, and I was in Halifax. They live in Vancouver, and she's a senior leader, and she's on the road all the time. So the meeting was for 8 o'clock in the morning, my time. So that's 4 o'clock Vancouver time. And I just naturally assumed she's probably in Toronto. So that's why we're having the meeting then. So after the meeting was over, I said to her, where are you? She said, well, I'm at home in Vancouver. I said, it's 4 o'clock in the morning. She says, I get up every morning at 4 and I spend the first couple of hours thinking strategically about my day. Very successful business person. So I get up early in the morning, but I can't match her. It's pretty cool.
No. That is good. Like my wake up is 5:30 typically, but now the sun's earlier. It seems to be 5-ish. But usually I've got 2 hours, and what I do is I call it yestermail. So all the stuff that stresses me out for not checking my emails today, right? Because I want to be present with you right now.
Yeah.
I pretty much do all my today emails tomorrow morning at 5 a.m. That's usually and that's kind of my strategic time in a way, because there's no disruptions. No new emails are coming in while I'm doing it. So you're cleaning out the inbox.
I hear you.
Dave's watched me struggle with that for years, and we finally figured it out a couple of years ago. But so in a way, I've got the time blocked out for my strategic time. I just maybe need to focus on something more strategic than checking emails. But that would be my takeaway for today, is being a little more tactical with those 2 hours in the morning.
Well, I think everybody should develop a calendar that includes strategic time. It doesn't have to be every day, but if it's every second day, that's great. Because when I asked senior team members how much time, well, first I asked them, are you spending enough time thinking strategically? And almost 90% said no. So how much more time per week do you need to spend in order for you to meet the demands of your job? And most people say 4 to 6 hours more per week. Now, in the book, I give people dozens and dozens of ways for how to find that time. So we talk about why it's so important in the book and what gets in the way, but there's a model there that talks about, here are the 4 things you need to be thinking about all the time to be able to make strategic time. And if you follow these, do these 4 things, and you follow these techniques, you should be able to, most people should be able to find 5 to 6 hours a week. But whether they will or not is another matter. And so the key is, once you form a really strong intention that this is really important, this is going to be good for my career, it's going to be good for my business, it's going to be good for my people, I've got to find this time. When I find the time, I'm going to get better at it. And then we start getting that in the calendar, I think big changes start to happen in your life and in your work.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, and the other piece of that is, I read a good article, I think it was The Guardian, but it was about how we're all built a little differently in terms of when we're kind of at our best cognitively. And some people, like both of you, are probably clearly early morning. I think they call them larks, and then they have another term for like the owls. Like later,
yeah.
I'm kind of a later in the day guy.
Yeah.
But I have little people that get me up early in the morning. So
right.
And I'm not in any place to think strategically at that point. But but to your point, Vince, I guess it's like wherever it is. But more importantly, having the discipline, like understanding the and seeing the value, which creates a commitment, and then creating the discipline to make sure it actually happens.
Right.
So great advice. Great advice.
Thank you.
Well, this has been wonderful. I'm so glad you came on. And we're for people that want to contact you directly, do they just go off the website that you mentioned earlier, Senior Advisory?
Yep, seniorteamadvisory.com. My contact information is in there, and I'd love to hear from them. I hope people go and take a look at the archive. I'd love to have them sign up for the blog, because I read it, and I think there's a lot of information in here that I think would be helpful for senior team members. And I do this because I'm a big believer in the value of really effective senior teams, and the impact that really good senior people make in their organizations, but also in society at large. So anything that I can do to support them and provide advice that might help them.
Your blog comes in Mondays, and it if I don't have a chance to read it, it goes into a folder I have called Interesting Stuff, along with other guests like Seth Godin, and so it's Greg, you'll enjoy it. It's good. It's a good read, and it's not overwhelming, right? It's just once a week, and but it's good, kind of creative time and cool artwork as well.
Thank you.
So,
thank you.
Awesome, Vince. Well,
Thanks,
Vince, thank you so much for coming on today, my friend.
It's a pleasure. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
All right. Take care.
Okay.
Take care.
See you,
Bye.
Vince.
Thanks for checking out this episode of Boiling Point. Remember to rate and subscribe to us on iTunes and follow us on Twitter at Boiling Point Pod. To see more from Dave Vale, check out leadershipunleashed.ca or visioncoachinginc.com, and on Twitter at Dave_Vale. And to catch up with Greg, visit hemmingshouse.com and at Greg Hemmings on Twitter. Thanks for listening, and remember, keep that pot boiling.